Good afternoon, everybody. Buenas tardes. It's great to be back at ICOM. And today's panel, I really liked it, in the sense that, we all talk about big data, but let's be honest, most of you have heard about, big data is like teen sex. Everybody has heard about it. Everybody, says they're doing it, but let's be honest. And for those of you who were this morning, I personally was impressed by Glenn White, who's the Director of Marketing Infrastructure at Electronic Arts. And so when we were preparing this session, Katrin Ribant, who's Chief Solutions Officer and co-founder of Datorama, we said, let's put him on the spotlight. Let's not, so Katrin is going to give one sentence about Datorama, and then we're going to inquisite Glenn, get him back to this morning joke. So without further delay, I want to leave as much time as we can to Glenn. So please, Katrin, go ahead.
Thank you, Rene. Well, hopefully it's not going to be quite the Spanish Inquisition. Do you still have your costume? So yes, I'm just going to do like one sentence of introduction about what is Datorama. For those of you who never heard of Datorama, it's a business intelligence platform for marketing. So we handle end-to-end everything from data acquisition, from your ad servers, DSPs, social networks, search engines, etc., to stitching all of that data together, building your data models, to the analytics part of computations, analytics, predictive analytics, etc., to the consumption part of dashboarding, reporting, and ultimately communication with third-party applications. So what we're going to talk about today is data science and how data science become real. So in data science, we have data, and essentially that is what we're going to focus in this session, is understand how very pragmatically, very concretely, from a real-world experience, do you build the kind of data sets that allow you to extract value with a data science process for your organization. And so for that, we are going to kind of start looking at your experience, Glenn, from from a marketer's perspective of somebody who has actually done this. So could you walk us through what it has taken for EA to get to the data set that you currently have?
Sure. I think to start, we started with the concept, and I apologize for folks who were here earlier. We started from the idea that EA is truly going to become player-centric. We had external stimulus that sort of drove us to that, but there's a very sort of high-level buy-in from CEO on down that player first is our mantra, that we repeat it over and over again. We believe it. There are big signs all over the campus. And so you start with the idea that we are most concerned with understanding our players. And if you start with that, then the next logical part of that is that you really need to federate your data, right? There's all sorts of barriers, and I've been listening to a lot of the talks today, and a lot of the themes in the conversations is all about the sort of the political obstacles that you have when you've got different groups who believe that they own their own data, or they're not really concerned about other people's data, and so on and so forth. But if you're being honest with yourself in terms of a brand, if you're being honest and you're saying, yeah, we really care about our customers, we're really customer-centric, if you believe that, then those barriers by definition have to be dissolved. And nobody says that that's easy, and there's some institutional resistance to that. But if you start seeing the value that sort of integrating that data brings, if you marry the idea that at a very high level, you believe that we have to understand our customers and all the points that go into understanding what that customer is. If you really need to do that, you need to remove those obstacles and really sort of knock those down.
And if I understand well, for you, this has been a multi-year journey that has involved a lot of kind of strategy and implementing tactics, including around ad ops and relationship with vendors, building an infrastructure to own the data. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So there's when you're talking about federating the data, you have to understand that that's all of your internal data, right? So that's finance or marketing operations or all of the data that we have. At EA, we have tons and tons of game telemetry, right? Which is obviously a competitive advantage for us. We know your favorite team and so on. But it also includes all the stuff that happens sort of outside when they're not playing our games, right? It's whether or not they saw a video on YouTube or whether or not they clicked on a banner ad or they visited our website. And some of that data is either second party or it's with our partners. And we explained sort of our vision, and over the last 2 years, we've made some pretty good headway in having our partners share that data with us and been able to bring a lot of that data in-house, right? The understanding that we needed this data for practical purposes. We explained what our reasonings were to really understand that holistic view of our players, and we've been able to discuss with them the obstacles that are around some of that, privacy and some other concerns. But you can negotiate around all that. You can convince most of your partners that this data is important and you need to bring it in-house. Or you need to share it somewhere. You need to aggregate it somewhere. Even if you're not going to do it yourself, even if you decide that you want to use a third party to aggregate all of your data and do all of that, you need some ability to get that data back. And for us, we've been able to do that sort of at an individual grain.
So at this point, you have a set of data that is looking at some of your customers, players kind of behavior. You have a lot of the data that is looking at your media activity. You can tie these somewhat together or together at an individual grain, and now it's time to start providing value to your business with this. So the first step, generally in a journey like this, is around understanding kind of what context you work in within your organization, who are your stakeholders, and ultimately, who needs to see what type of information out of the data that you have. I mean, anybody who has any background in statistics and has done any statistical project knows that the first step is you do descriptive statistics. You look at your data, you look at what decisions you can make out of the simplest kind of levels of aggregation of your data, and you build a base of consensus in your organization around how you're going to extract value out of these assets that you build. So what we see here on these slides is a number of views around campaign, around content that is aggregated for campaigns that are done for a lot of the games that EA does. And there are different levels of aggregations around financial data that go to the CFO. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of your stakeholder map and how that works in your organization?
Sure. We view reporting from sort of the bottom up rather than the top down. I think that we started with the idea that we needed to get to operational level reporting. The idea that there were people that were pushing buttons and pulling levers that were actually executing our buys, and we needed to provide a certain level of granularity in order to allow them to optimize their campaigns. And then from that, there are sort of higher level campaigns like burn rate across an entire franchise or burn rate across a region. And then above that, you had title by title for those studios. And then above that, you had sort of executive level reporting. But you start from sort of what those metrics need to be. You define your metrics, of course, right? And then you figure out what each stakeholder actually needs. We view our primary stakeholders as our operators, right? We want our planners and buyers to have the very best data as fast as possible. It's not to say that the executives don't need their reporting, but priority has to go in operations.
And so now one step beyond, kind of conversely with what you discussed this morning around the need to foster engagement with your players. If you look at your attribution, you have a very defined goal around what it is that you're looking for in an attribution model and how it helps you look at your content and understand what content is going to help you with engagement with what kind of group of players.
Yeah. So most people, when they do multi-touch attribution, shout out to Steve, great presentation. The idea there is that ultimately a lot of people do multi-touch attribution to a conversion event, and that conversion event usually is assigned to a dollar value. At EA, we don't do all of our conversions as dollars. Sometimes it's a second approximation of dollars, right? Sometimes we want to drive engagement, or we want to drive people back into a game, we want to prevent churn. There are all these things that we do, and we optimize our campaigns against those specific things. When you have all of the data in a single place and you're able to kind of look at the entire chain of all of the events that you have, you can tie individual player behavior or events to that and optimize against that rather than a purchase or any other. A conversion event's a conversion event, right? And so you're able to optimize certain channels or dial up or dial down certain things in order to be able to control other variables that are things other than dollars. We do obviously, for mobile in particular, we optimize against LTV. We try to get the best possible players, but we pull all sorts of levers for all sorts of metrics. It's not just against dollars.
Well, okay. Well, I guess we all have questions for you, Glenn, but if I may, I get the first one. You were talking this morning about the relationship that you've created with DSPs, that you've established partnerships with them. Mm-hmm. Could I double-click on it and have a more in-depth, explanation? Because we had lunch and you had amazing things.
Sure. So the partnerships with our DSPs revolve mainly around the sharing of data, right? And so, as I alluded to before, the idea that you partner with your DSP and you make an understanding that the data that you're gathering for it is for your use in order to be able to understand your players better. Their primary concern around this, the primary hurdle that we heard over and over again when we were dealing with the DSP, is they were afraid that we were going to take all this data and insight and we were going to generate retargeting audiences somewhere else. That is, we'd stop spending with them when we'd spend with somebody else and use that data to retarget. We don't use any of the data that we gather from our DSPs that we ingest internally and all this other stuff. We anonymize it all. So it's a one-way hash that allows us to tie it to first-party behavior and do all of our modeling, but we can't then take lists of people from that data and retarget on it. Doing that gives us the ability to provide models and so on and so forth and do our attribution and multi-touch attribution and channel optimization without actually giving them the concern that if we want to reach our players, if we want to retarget, we do have to go back to that platform. And once we started having that conversation on a regular basis, we were able to overcome a lot of the obstacles to actually delivering that data.
I love the retargeting thing. Okay, guys, who's got a question? Here in the front.
Wait for a mic or just yell out?
The mic, please.
Fascinating conversation. So Glenn, I totally understand how your model works within the digital universe, right? But you also have non-digital efforts where you don't have this kind of precision in data. Yes. So do you look at that aside, or do you somehow work it in here?
So that's a great question. Admittedly, we don't do as much television as a lot of people, but we do television, we do out of home, and so on and so forth. We tie that in probabilistically based on the markets that we're running that television, and we know exactly the times and dates that those things are running. And so because of that, we can put a probabilistic model that basically puts a point on the journey that says, could have been exposed to TV media as well. And then when you look at like audiences and like regions and you separate those two out, you model them separately and you go, okay, television had a certain amount of effect here because we're seeing these two are roughly the same curve. We see a slight spike over here, the ad ran here. So it's not we take it out entirely. It's more probabilistic than we would like. We're clearly, obviously looking at addressable television to try to improve that a lot better. But we don't exclude any of the stuff. You can do it if you're willing to test against it and so on and so forth.
Any other question? Come on, guys, I know it's after lunch.
They're just tired of me, dude.
They're tired?
They're tired of me.
Okay, then I have a question for Katrin. Because you've had a journey of, 2-3 years almost, and now you manage petabytes of information. So my question for Katrin is, okay, imagine you have a new client, a new person coming in, and you have to find him, what path to follow. Where should they start to follow Glenn's
generally,
journey?
what we kind of see and definitely recommend is most people don't necessarily start with individual grain data. Most people start with owning their first-party data at an aggregate level. So creative level, keyword level, maybe geographical breakdowns. And the level of kind of connecting their marketing at the data layer across channels from all of the perspectives that make sense to their business, a business unit, a product, a geography, etc., across all of what they have, allows for a lot of insights and a lot of forecasting at that level already. The step kind of after that is having a look at what is happening on an individual level, things like attribution, things like path analysis, potentially marrying that data with CRM. But that's definitely not something that we see done as a first step.
So it's like getting back to the earlier panel, it's not running, but start walking.
Exactly.
Okay, I don't know how we are time-wise, because it was a 15-minute session. Are we okay? Do we still have time for a next question? Okay, come on, guys. You know, I'm going to stand up there, here, and I'm not going to move until somebody asks a question. And I'm going to be silent. And you won't be absolved by the church of advertisers. Okay, hands there.
I leave the floor to the other person.
Hi, thank you. I was really impressed with the point of view of if you have this subscriber-first attitude or user-first attitude with your data, that at some stage you have to share. And certainly if you're dealing with our friends in the DSP or the programmatic environment, my question to you is if those game players or subscribers are important to you, they're your gold, they're your lifeblood, how do you actually stop leakage of data if that data is shared outside in that ecosystem in terms of other demand, if you like, through the DSPs looking to utilize the same data? How do you avoid that? Is it purely contractual, or is there some technical way in which you can avoid leakage?
I'm going to play that question back because it's kind of a lot to unpack. But the question was, how do we sort of prevent leakage because there's a certain amount of federation of data, and if we're sharing that,
yeah,
how do you prevent leakage? So the first-party data never really leaves our hands, to put too fine a point on it. Our audiences obviously do, but we do a fair amount of, I think obfuscation is probably too much of a word, but we use some obfuscation in order to be able to hide what the audience is, what we're trying to accomplish when we syndicate those audiences out. Between the groups themselves, there's no obfuscation at all. Anybody at EA can utilize any of our data.
Yeah, sure. So where I was coming from is if you're using it to assist your own marketing activity, but then also you're dealing with the DSP market, which deal with many, many, many different demand partners, agencies, advertisers, all with similar insight, and you may have a money-making business there to help them target your audience in an attribution model.
Our team supports all of our external agencies and all that other stuff in the generation of those audiences, and we syndicate all those audiences on their behalf. That's what my team fundamentally does, is basically manage most of this data and handle all of it. We don't syndicate all of our information to an agency, for example, and let them do it. They have no access to it. If they tell us what they're trying to accomplish, we generate that audience.
Yeah, so internal targeting from rather than external passing of data.
Exactly, and that was part of the earlier conversation where I said, you know, your shift goes towards actually managing the audience generation in-house, and that's where we are.
Okay,
Thank
guys,
you.
I'm sorry, time's up. Before we close, just one thing. So tomorrow, during the coffee break in the morning, you can join me if you want on a round table to deep dive what we've been discussing today. So looking forward to see many of you tomorrow. And thank you very much for the two speakers.
Thank you.